outstanding thought leadership and business value. So very excited to be here today and share what we've learned. So a bit about me. I joined Delta Dental about 2.5 years ago, and I currently oversee identity and access management as well as cybersecurity operations. But when I first joined, I had more of a GRC role, or governance, risk, and compliance. This is my forte, and I spent the early part of my career in IT audit. So I led and oversaw various audits, including Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA. Over time, this evolved into enterprise risk management and eventually into cybersecurity. So I worked for a variety of companies, both in healthcare and financial services, including USAA, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as Baxter International. So Baxter is a medical device company, and they make dialysis machines and infusion pumps. And I was actually on the IoT security side. So I had to learn all about FDA regulations as they apply to security. So not sure if all of you are aware, but some of the modern medical devices are actually connected to wireless networks or cloud technologies. In the past, the medical devices were pretty much standalone, and a nurse would have to enter a prescription into the device. But now, if the security isn't appropriately applied, then in theory, someone could modify a prescription or dosage in transit before it reaches the patient. So it was quite different from enterprise security. You know, I learned a lot while I was there, and like I said, it was quite different and unusual, much more than just protecting patient information. But you know, so bottom line is I understand regulations and standards around security and privacy, and I know how to make sure that companies are in compliance with those regulations. On a personal note, I am Indian Canadian, so if I sound a bit like Justin Bieber or Celine Dion, now you know why. I'm glad I can't see your reactions to that one. Okay. So in terms of my company, Delta Dental and its affiliates form one of the largest dental insurance networks in the country. We're a member of the Delta Dental Plans Association, and we provide dental coverage to over 35 million enrollees. Delta is a nonprofit organization, and one of the reasons I love working here is because of their commitment to dental education as well as supporting low-income communities. So what is third-party cyber risk? According to Delta, it is the exposure of corporate assets to external entities that have an ongoing business relationship with our organization. So that includes vendors, suppliers, and other business partners. So as larger organizations continue to enhance their cyber defenses, adversaries are increasingly targeting third parties with less mature cyber capabilities. So we have to look beyond our perimeter to those third parties who share our confidential information and who have access to our networks to ensure that they have the appropriate safeguards in place. At Delta, we also have two other groups that fall under the third-party umbrella, and these are providers, who are essentially our dentists, as well as brokers. But currently we have over 150,000 providers and 30,000 brokers. So it's very difficult to have a team that's large enough to assess all these groups. So we decided to accept the risk of those two groups by contracts. So we have signed business associate agreements with them, and they also have to abide by the HIPAA security rule. So because of that, we are just focusing on the high risk groups, which are vendors and suppliers. And we have about 800 or so of those. According to a recent Ponemon study, 53% of breaches are caused either directly or indirectly by a third party. This number has actually gone down from the prior year, where it was over 60%, but it's still a fairly significant risk to organizations. So let's look at some examples of third-party breaches that made the headlines. In 2013, Target was a victim of a large-scale data breach, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It started at their HVAC vendor. So the vendor was actually monitoring the air conditioning at their Target stores, and an employee of the HVAC vendor clicked on a phishing email. This email downloaded malware onto the vendor's network, and the malware stole credentials to Target's vendor portal. This led to a series of other events, which ultimately led to the breach. So Target lost millions because of this, and in fact, it was close to 160 million in losses. And from an executive impact, both the CEO and the CIO resigned soon afterwards. So pretty dire consequence for Target. Around the same time, there was a lesser known incident that happened at Boston Medical Center. They used a third-party transcription service that failed to password protect their physician portal. So anyone who knew the specific URL could have gone to that link and without logging in could have seen thousands of patient records. Now, there was no actual evidence that there was a breach, but a year later, a Massachusetts Superior Court ruled that any patient that was impacted by this event could sue Boston Medical for the mere probability of a breach. So like I said, pretty severe consequences for both of these companies. The same Ponemon study, which is actually called The Cost of Third-Party Cyber Risk Management, had a few other takeaways, and they assessed about 600 or so companies, and they found that on average, third parties were spending 15,000 hours a year completing third-party assessments, and that's equivalent to 7 full-time employees. On the other side, on average, companies were spending $2.1 million a year on vetting these third parties. So quite a bit of time and effort spent by both third parties and the customers. Yet, despite all this time and effort, 64% of them said that the processes were only somewhat effective or not effective at all. And a very small percent, 8%, actually said that the assessments did not lead to any sort of meaningful action. So how do companies come up with a third-party program that is actually effective and helps the company? And that is the challenge that the CISO of Delta Dental presented to me. So I report to him, and he said, when I joined in 2017, we didn't have a program, right? We had some lightweight sort of reviews done pre-contract, nothing done post-contract. And he said, look, it looks like companies are not developing effective programs, both competitors and others in the industry. So why don't you find out what they're doing and come up with a program that's really effective for Delta Dental? So I started to do the research. And the good thing for me is I also have another team that I manage called Technology Sales Support. And this team basically is the one that answers the questions from Delta's perspective. So when customers ask us how we manage security, we have to answer them, right? So that's the group that does that work. And so I was able to see all the different assessments from various companies. And of course, there are the exceptional companies like Google and Salesforce that have really leading programs. And it even gets down to where they want you to do a pen test using the vendor of their choice. So those are, the exceptions. But by and large, we found that there was a commonality, and there were 3 areas in which we felt we could improve the process. And I'm going to go through those 3 areas, and then I'm going to talk to you about the process at a high level. So the first thing we noticed about the third-party assessments that were being performed is that in general, they were driven by regulation. So if there was the bare minimum that a regulation required, that is what they did. At Delta, in 2017, we had like just about a year and a half to be in compliance with a regulation in New York called 23 NYCRR 500. Maybe some of you are aware of this, but it is a financial services regulation around cybersecurity. if you're doing business in the state of New York. And that regulation basically said you need to identify all your third parties, you have to assess them, and then it had some very granular requirements, like you have to make sure that they have the appropriate authentication controls in place and encryption controls. So I think if one was to be solely driven by regulation, that's all we would have done, right? Look at just what the regulation wanted. We also had a consultant come in and say to us, well, you know, you could solve this by just getting your list of third parties and running them all through a vendor scoring tool. And then you can say you've done it, right? So you can check the box. But we didn't want to do it that way. And we even decided that if we missed the deadline, then that was fine, but we would have to do it the right way. So if we were audited, we would talk about our approach and when we thought we would actually be done. So again, we're not driven by regulation, we're driven by doing the right thing, determining the nature of the business relationship and the impact of that third party to our business. The second thing we noticed was a lot of assessments use a one-size-fits-all approach. This means that we would receive questionnaires from smaller companies where we would typically get between 20 and 100 questions, and then the larger companies would send between 300 and 1,000 questions. And they were often based around some framework, like NIST 853, for example. And some of the questions didn't even apply to us because they were just based on all the NIST families, and we weren't necessarily providing that type of service. So what we decided was we're not going to use the one-size-fits-all. We're going to base it on the nature of the relationship. We're going to classify the third parties in 4 tiers, which I'll show you in a minute. And tier 1 being the highest impact to the organization from a cyber perspective, and tier 4 having no cyber impact. And then we're going to not just send assessments like just asking them what they do and then getting answers back, but we're actually going to do audits, mini audits. Now, if we had unlimited time and money, we could send everyone, you know, we could send all the third parties on-site audit requests, and then we could do it that way. But because we didn't have that sort of unlimited resources, we only have 5 people actually in the company right now doing this for us. So we had to decide which controls we really want to focus on and test them in a certain way that gives us confidence in the third party's capabilities. And then finally, a lot of the questionnaires were based on theoretical information, right? So let's say they have 300 questions. We weren't sure, but it seemed like they were just assessing all the requirements equally. And to be honest with you, at the time, we did not meet some of the requirements. And when we didn't meet a requirement, we generally just gave sort of an ambiguous answer. Things have changed since then, of course, but at the time we would just give an ambiguous answer, and we hardly ever heard back from a customer saying, what does this mean, or clarify. So it gave us the feeling that perhaps it was, again, done just to check a box to say that they've assessed us. But our approach uses cyber threat intelligence. So we use various threat intelligence reports. When we started, it was all external, but then as we completed more and more assessments, we actually had internal intelligence that we could use to weigh certain requirements more heavily than other requirements. So for example, application security controls would be weighed more heavily than do you review policies every year. So I'll get into the details of that as well. But those were the 3 big differences in where we thought we would make a more effective program. So how does this process work? Well, we have 2 different services. We have a pre-contract service and a post-contract. And I'm going to talk about the post-contract first. Most of the steps are actually the same as pre-contract, but with pre-contract, you definitely need more integration with the vendor management team, legal, and other areas. And you also have to make sure that a security addendum or some sort of contract is signed so that you have certain expectations already legally binding to the third party. So at a high level, the process works like this. You have 5 steps: compile, classify, assess, decide, and track. So I'm going to get into detail on each one. So in 2017, we did not have a centralized vendor inventory or source of truth. We literally had to go to different departments and ask them, do you have a list of the vendors that you use? And we started going through this exercise and realized that some of these lists were not very well, we couldn't really trust them. There were contracts that were maintained only by the department and not legal. So we thought, instead of going through this exercise, which would have actually taken much longer, we asked accounts payable to run an external spend report for the prior year to see who we paid. And as you can imagine, it was a huge file. It was like 300,000 rows of data in Excel. And so we took several months and just tried to filter this list down, right? So first we removed things like that were not related to a third party. For example, membership to certain organizations, charitable donations, travel expenses. So we first had to filter those down, and then we had sort of a pared down list, and then we removed all the duplicates. So this took probably 6 months because we had to track down the cost center sometimes, who paid for it, and then we had to identify who in the cost center actually signed the contract to understand what that third party was doing. So after all this work, we came up to about 800 unique vendors. And this number tends to fluctuate because sometimes you get new vendors added, some of them get terminated, but by and large, it's about 800 or so right now. And then we took this inventory and we decided to classify it by nature of relationship as well as impact to our company. So we came up with something called the Cyber Stratification Questionnaire. And this is about 30 questions or so. And the three key questions were, do you have access to our confidential data? Do you have system access or access to our data centers? And the third is, do you have physical access to our office locations? And so if the answer was yes to any of those, then it would be considered a cyber impact vendor, right? So it would be tiers 1 to 3. If the answer was no to all three, then it would be a tier 4 vendor. So some of the questions in this questionnaire led to the tier, and then other questions determined what was the type of relationship, and then that would determine what exactly we would test. So like I said, we weren't using the one-size-fits-all approach, right? We were going to cater it to what they actually do for us. In terms of the tiers themselves, we have 4 tiers, and the tiers also determine how often we will assess them going forward. A tier 1 would be assessed annually, tier 2 every 2 years, tier 3 every 3 years. The only thing that could change that is if they had, let's say, a security incident. If an incident happened, then perhaps instead of annually, we would go back every 6 months just to make sure. A tier 2 could become a tier 1 if there was a security incident. So getting into the tiers themselves, as you can see, tier 1 is if they have access to over 500 records of PHI or any amount of PCI data. Now, this was actually not as easy as it looks. In the beginning, we actually said any PHI makes you a tier 1. And we started doing that, and we realized that even the law firms, for example, that had a court case going and they had 1 record of PHI because of the court case, they were falling into tier 1. So we talked to the consultants who were helping us build this. It was actually Price Waterhouse. And they said, typically you don't want more than 10% of your vendors in tier 1, because you have to, basically make the best use of your resources and the time. So this took a little bit of doing, and then this is what we came up with. So tier 1, greater than 500. Tier 2 was less than 500 records of PHI or any confidential information, as well as access to our data centers. And so an example of that would be like Target's HVAC vendor who goes into our data centers. So that would be a tier 2. And a tier 3 would be anyone who enters our office buildings without needing any sort of an escort of any sort. So a janitorial service is an example. Any other professional organization that's helping with consulting services who has a badge. So they would be in the tier 3 category. And then of course, tier 4, we have a lot of companies, the toothpaste vendors. We also have like lawn service, that would all fall into tier 4. So in terms of assessing the vendors, like I said, we can't test everything, so we had to focus on the important things. And so we looked at various reports, including the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, to determine what are some of these controls, what are some of these requirements that, if they weren't there, would actually cause a breach. So if anyone has read the recent Verizon report, and by the way, we read it every year just to see if things change, but the 3 major reasons companies get breached are, number 1, phishing emails, right, or social engineering. So you want to make sure that a third party has a solid security awareness training program, and that they've included the right topics in that program. And that it's not just once a year, but there's an ongoing sort of reminder to people not to click on these emails, because that's the number 1 reason for the breaches. The other thing is stolen credentials, right? A lot of times when they get stolen, you know, if people don't have the minimum necessary access and they have beyond what they need, then you know, a hacker gets essentially the keys to the kingdom. So you want to make sure that your access management practices are working effectively. And then one of the other big ones is web application security. So we always make sure that we test that one, and we weigh those particular controls a little bit more heavily than some of the other controls. Like I said, you know, if you have policies but you don't review them annually, okay, it's bad, but it's not the worst thing. That's not really why companies get breached, right? So we looked at some of these reports. We also referred to the NIST 853 standard. We didn't use it verbatim, but we definitely referred to some of the areas there, because we didn't want to necessarily exclude any controls that were important, just because Verizon didn't refer to them, right? But we just wanted to make sure that we took the spirit of those different the groups of families, to make sure that they were tested in some way. And the Cloud Security Alliance controls, same thing. If there was a cloud vendor, then we would definitely refer to those requirements when we test them. And we had very clear validation steps, so that it didn't matter which analyst actually did the testing, they would use similar processes, and tried our best to remove some of the subjectivity during the testing. That's a little bit difficult, because ultimately, you know, if it was that easy to put down as rule sets, you wouldn't need a human to do it, right? So there's definitely some subjectivity as you do it, and experience of the analyst. But by and large, we have about, let's see, 30 controls or so that's in our catalog that we end up testing. So here's some examples of controls that we test. The first one is application security. And by the way, for all of these, we always ask for policies and procedures, just as a starting point. So here are some ways you could test application security. For example, you could find out if they're doing static code analysis or dynamic code analysis. And the kind of evidence you could ask for is maybe a screenshot of their console. If they're using, let's say, Fortify for static code analysis, you could ask for either the screenshot, or you could actually set up a WebEx meeting, which we often do, just to make sure that we can see that they have this tool in place. They can also give us code reports, code analysis reports. Now, sometimes they don't want to do this, so it just depends on the vendor. Some of them agree, some of them are a little more cautious. We don't even mind if it's redacted, as long as we know that these reports exist. You could also check that they have release management controls, so that a developer can't move code to production, right? You want to make sure that those segregation of duties are in place. The other one is security checks during the SDLC process. Do they have gates which prevent them from moving to the next stage without, you know, before, or making sure that they check before they move code to make sure there are no vulnerabilities in the code. So you want to make sure that they have these things, and how they present them to you, it varies by vendor. And some of the larger vendors shouldn't be surprised by these requests, because I'm sure that the larger companies are all auditing them anyway, so they shouldn't really have a problem with that. You could also ask for defect tickets, let's say JIRA tickets that show that security defects are being addressed and tracked. And one of the other big ones is, if they've had any pen testing done on their web applications, you can see a summary report or some sort of redacted report to show that they've actually had that done. Another example requirement is external transmission. And by the way, these are 3 requirements that tend to fail quite often. That's why I highlighted them here. So for external transmission, you want to see if they have DLP solutions for email to see that they're, it can detect PHI in emails before it goes out, or portable media. Also, if they have CASB solutions, let's say like Netscope is a popular one, right? So the CASB should be able to alert or block PHI or other sensitive data from going to SaaS applications. So again, probably looking at consoles and seeing if you can actually, if they're willing to show you their policies, CASB policies, that would actually be a very good test as well. Web proxies, right, to make sure that certain websites are being blocked internally, so therefore data cannot be exfiltrated as easily. You also want to check if they have IDS or IPS systems in place in terms of making sure external transmission is protected. And finally, if data in transit is encrypted. So these are some of the ideas of what you can test. And I'd be curious if any of you are also doing some of these tests and some types of evidence that you're able to gather. So after this, I'd love to hear back from you in the audience as well. Access management. Now this one tends to fail quite a bit, especially if you look at SOC 2 reports. This is one that commonly has an issue or two. So we look to see if you have multi-factor authentication, especially when it comes to privileged accounts or remote access. If there are password policies in place and what kind of policies they have. And access approvals is another huge one. Are you granting access only after someone actually approves it? Is there evidence that it's been approved? Are you recertifying access annually or even quarterly for privileged access? And deprovisioning, are you ensuring that you're deprovisioning in a timely manner? So these are some of the things that we look at. With other types of assessments, in general, they're just asking questions, so you don't know for sure. So this just takes it one step further, right? Show us evidence. It's a trust but verify model. So depending on the tier, we would either go have a sort of a deeper review or a lighter touch review. So as you can see, tier 1, we go a little bit further, obviously highest impact to the organization. Some of the things we do are incident evaluation. So if there is an incident, you want to do a root cause analysis to see why it happened. And one of the things we like to do is see if our process would have caught that before the incident happened. And in some cases, we don't, right? It wouldn't have caught it, so we enhance our processes further. An example that we had actually twice for 2 of our vendors who had incidents was because they didn't perform pen tests on an annual basis. And there was really no other way to identify that vulnerability unless they had done that pen test. So that's why we weigh pen testing a bit higher than some of the other requirements. The next thing we do is we ask them if they have any SOC 2 or high trust reports that are already out there. So that will actually save us some time in having to ask for these pieces of evidence individually. If they have a report, we just tie it directly to our requirements list, and we may just have to ask for specific pieces, additional pieces of evidence. But overall, we can leverage this quite a bit. Early on, when we were designing the service, we were trying to find some sort of machine learning tool that would actually look through the SOC 2 reports to speed up the process. But we couldn't really find anything that worked. So if anyone here knows of a tool that would help, so we're not just doing manual reviews of these reports, that would be great. But right now, we're literally just looking by hand. But the team's been doing it for 2 years now, and they're pretty adept at doing it. They know exactly the right keywords and structure of these reports, so they can do it pretty quickly. And then remote and deep dive remote are pretty much, they're not that different. I think when we first started, we thought we would go further for the tier 1s and 2s, and sometimes we do, right? It just depends. Like I said, there is some subjectivity here, but most of our work is done remotely. We try not to go on site until it's absolutely necessary. In some cases, for example, with clearinghouses, we work with clearinghouses who have access to a lot of our personal health information. And a clearinghouse is essentially a vendor that takes any records that comes from our dentist on our way to us so that we can process the claim. And they arrange it in a certain way where it's standardized so that when it goes into our claims processing system, it doesn't cause any errors. So this is one group that we actually did go on site for one of them at one time. So anyway, I hope this is making sense so far. So compile, classify, assess. And once we complete the assessment, we may end up with some findings, right? Some issues. So we document a summary report and we put those issues in there. And we have 3 classifications of issues. We have high, medium, and low. And a high issue would be, you know, you are not doing any sort of pen testing, for example. That's a high issue for sure. If you don't have policies, then perhaps that's a medium issue. If you have policies, but you're not reviewing them annually, but you have some sort of recurring review, then that might be a low issue. So there's a little bit of, you know, judgment involved there. But typically when you talk to executives, they don't want to know how many high issues or medium issues you found for a vendor. They just ask you, did the vendor meet expectations or not meet expectations? And so we came up with this sort of criteria that would help us sort of draw the line, you know, the above the line, below the line. And so an example is, if you have a tier 1 vendor and they have more than one high issue, then automatically they don't meet expectations. And so these numbers aren't exact, but it's just to give you sort of an illustration. If you're a tier 2 vendor and you have more than 5 low issues, then again, you don't meet expectations. So you should put something like this together if you choose to use this model for your program. So once the report is generated, we provide it to the business relationship owner. This is the person who signed the contract or a delegate of the person who signed the contract with the vendor. So they have various options for the issues that you identified. So they could either accept the risk of the issue. And by the way, in that summary report, we not only put the description of the issue, we also put the business impact. So we put it in words in which the business can understand. Because remember, there are people in marketing and finance and other areas who have signed up with these third parties. So they wouldn't understand if you use very technical language in the report. But once they understand the issue and you sit down with them and actually make sure they understand it, they can either accept it, right? And if they accept it, depending on the severity of the issue, we have to escalate it to the right level within the organization. So, and I'll show you the escalation matrix in a minute, but you want to make sure that there's correct accountability in the organization. And then you have the mitigate option, which is of course our favorite one. We want to make sure that issues are mitigated to lower the risk to the organization. We only have 5 people on our team, so we can't chase down every issue with every vendor that we work with. So we rely on the business relationship owner to work on working with the vendor, mitigating the issue. We might give some guidance, but we can't go too far there just because, again, resource constraints. But our goal is not just to find issues and try to terminate relationships with vendors, right? We want to see if we can help the vendors, especially the smaller ones. They truly want to do the right thing, but they almost don't know how. So they ask us for our advice. We give them some ideas of what they can do to resolve their issues. And down the road, I would even, I'm hoping to get to the point where we can even offer security awareness training to some of them who simply can't afford to do that on their own. And that way we're helping not only the vendor, but just the overall ecosystem of third parties. So mitigation is, again, to be followed up by the business relationship owner, and then they're supposed to come back to us when the issue has been resolved so we can retest it. We don't wait like another year to go retest it. If it's a high issue, we kind of expect it to be done in a month or less. The third option is transferring the risk. And this is not used very often, but I guess in theory it could be. If you have a third party that has some sort of issues, some sort of findings, and you think, well, I don't want to terminate the relationship, or I can't terminate it because the contract won't allow us to, then you could maybe bring some of the work back in-house, or maybe move some of the work to another third party. So that's another option. And then the fourth option is to avoid the risk altogether. So this one's a bit difficult, especially post-contract, unless you have something in the contract that they specifically violate. Otherwise, they could push back on this. So we haven't seen too many of these. And like I said, we're not looking to, unless something is a very blatant violation, we're not really trying to go this route. But it works pretty well in the pre-contract process, because if we find something prior to signing the contract, we can just go with another vendor, right? And then you avoid the risk. In terms of escalation, and this is where I was saying, if you accept the risk, you can't have a manager, a line manager, accepting a high risk on a tier 1. So you want to come up with some sort of escalation process or matrix. So for us, for high issues, you need to be a senior vice president or above. And for medium issues, a VP. If it's a low, it doesn't necessarily have to go to a director every time, but depends on how many low issues you're talking about. Again, we have thresholds, and this is illustrative. If you can choose however you wish to, have an escalation process for your own program. And then in terms of tracking, we have various dashboards that we create. This one is just an example of one that we use for our VPs. And it has a lot of interesting information, right? This would not be board level, by the way, because a board would find this, I think, far too detailed. But as you can see on the left, and I couldn't use actual data, okay, so just remember this is fake data, just so that you can get an idea of what we report. So in the upper left, you have the list of third parties. You have 800 third parties. I'm sorry, not the list, just the count. And you can see how many tier 1s, 2s, and 3s we have. So more than 60% are tier 4, right? So we don't, this is really what you want in an ideal scenario. And again, this is based on what Pricewaterhouse told us on how other companies classified their third parties. So you want about 10% tier 1, and then about 60% or so in your tier 4 category. The second one, service delivery. This one is just telling the executives how far we've come in terms of assessing our backlog, because we hadn't actually done it before. We wanted to show that we've actually done all 800. In some way, you still have to complete an assessment for a tier 4 in terms of understanding the impact. So at this point, we're very close. I think this is old data. Actually, this is not even real data, but I think we've already completed the backlog, and we're working on any new third parties that join Delta Dental. On the bottom, as you can see, you have to put there which third parties meet expectations versus do not meet, right? This is where those thresholds matter. This is really what executives want to see. They don't want to know this one has 2 highs or 3 mediums. It doesn't mean anything. So having some thresholds really makes a difference. And at one point we had projected versus actual because we hadn't completed our backlog. But at this point, everything is about done. But the other thing you want to make sure of is, you don't really want all or a majority of third parties to fail, right? If you do that, then the business kind of loses confidence in what you're doing and maybe sees it as being disruptive, right? So you want to do it in stages, right? Try to do it in a pragmatic way. And then over time, you just continue to improve the process and improve your relationships with the business and the third parties as well. And on the upper right-hand side, this was actually one we thought was really useful, just to show them what are the top issues that tend to fail. And they found this very interesting and enlightening as well. And I actually showed you the 3, right? So web application security. Another one that tends to fail is encryption and key management. That's one, because people sometimes they don't rotate their keys, or they don't manage the encryption keys very well. So that's one that fails a lot. Access management is up there on the list as well, and external transmission. And then on the bottom right, just like we saw in the Ponemon study, they say it never leads to actions. Well, our program actually does lead to action. So you can see there that we have a section of it that has been mitigated, a few of them are accepted, there's no doubt, and then there's a whole bunch that are outstanding. So we definitely try to make sure that the business understands the risks, and then it's up to them what they decide. Cybersecurity doesn't make the decisions, we just present the information so that decisions can be made with the right info. One of the things that was really good for us is early on, we had a lot of interest from some of the VPs, and they were asking to see these reports and saying, well, who's accepting the risks? And so they started to champion our cause and telling people they can't accept risks, especially if they're high issues, they can't just accept them. So we actually had people in the company who helped drive this and make it more successful. So that was really helpful as well. Now, in terms of the pre-contract process, and I don't have a slide on that right now, but essentially it's the same, right? It's the same. You would classify, assess, decide, and track. However, you're not compiling, you're adding to the list. So before you even add to the list, you want to do some sort of comparison. So you may want to create a small questionnaire, which will help compare between 4 or 5 vendors, right? And we actually have a questionnaire like that. It's about 20 questions, and a lot of them are very black and white questions, right? Do you have a CISO and a security program? Do you perform independent audits every year? Have you had a security breach in the last 18 months? So things which are not as subjective, so you can actually compare different vendors and then help the business in choosing the right vendor. This has to be driven, though, by a larger vendor management program, and cyber should just be one of the factors, as is financial viability and other types of risks. So we do work with the vendor management team, and we're engaged as needed. The other thing we do is once a vendor is selected and they want to move forward, we have a security addendum that we require them to sign. And we had to work very closely with legal to make sure that we had the right security terms and conditions put in there. Because if you have security conditions that are too broad, then it would be hard to hold the third party to those terms and conditions. And if they're too detailed, then they become obsolete in a year or two. So you have to find that right balance. And I would say that's much more individual per company. You have to work with your legal team to see how to do that. But you definitely want to align it with the kind of requirements you're expecting from your third party and make sure that they can't push back in case there is a finding. The other thing you want to include in there is the right to audit clause. If you don't say that, we have the right to audit you once a year or once in 6 months or whatever you think is appropriate, then they can push back on that as well. So it's very important to make sure that security addendum is included in your contracts. So again, just to recap, the 3 big areas in which we have had some effective, more effective processes are: number 1, we don't base our program solely on regulations. We base it on what the right thing is to do, the impact of the third party on the business, and the nature of the business relationship. The second thing, as I mentioned earlier, is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We customize and tailor the assessment based on the type of business relationship, the type of service or product that the third party provides. And finally, we use threat intelligence data to make sure that we're correctly choosing the weight for different requirements is based on what tends to fail the most and what causes the most breaches. So by doing that, we create brand protection, so we don't end up like the targets of the world and make headlines. Like, we don't want that. Second thing we do is we provide the kind of support to make informed business decisions. And finally, when customers ask us if we protect their data, we can answer with a resounding yes. And that definitely helps me to sleep better at night. So thank you very much. I hope this has helped you, and that I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. That was awesome. And we do have more than a few questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to get started with just a question that I have right off the bat. So with SOC 2, I know that pen tests are required. And I'm thinking in terms of vendors in general. And I know that, back, I don't know, in my recent past, when I was a vendor at a security company, if I were trying to sell my products or services to anyone, SOC 2 level 1 and level 2 were base level requirement. So I'm thinking in terms of pen tests. Isn't that just like, I'm sorry, if you want to do business with me at all, you have to do annual pen tests? Or are there people who actually can slide on that? So just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. So again, it would depend on the tier, right? If we had a tier 3, which is a janitorial service that has access to our data just by walking around the company, this wouldn't be the kind of company you would require a pen test. But if it's a tier 1, then yeah, we would absolutely require that. The problem we had is a lot of our vendors are smaller companies who just can't afford this. So we have to take that into consideration. Pen tests are expensive. SOC 2 reports are expensive. So we can, it depends on the size of the company and what they're doing for you. But yeah, if it's a large company and they have access to a lot of our PHI, we absolutely, we require them to do a pen test. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Makes sense. So next question, and this is coming from Sean Todd. And this is, how do you track down vendors that sneak in through the shadow IT or other channels that are not your normal onboarding channel, including those that are quote unquote free?
Right. So, I mean, I have that AP report that we had generated, right? So that will tell you exactly who got paid and which cost center paid for it. So that's the way to do it. I mean, if you try to go vertical by vertical and ask people who their vendors are, that's when you'll miss it. But AP reports definitely catch every spend that went out that year or that month. So I would say that's the way to go. That's why we chose the AP route.
Okay, that makes sense. And so next question coming up from Lynn Kaiser. And this is, how might an organization decide on the right balance of using third-party cybersecurity consulting and auditing services versus building in-house expertise?
That's actually a good one. So you're saying, like, instead of having, like, my team, like I have 5 people, instead of having them, what is that the kind of is that the question? I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And I'll read it one more time. It's how might an organization decide on the right balance of using third-party cybersecurity consulting and auditing services versus building in-house expertise?
Yeah. No, that's actually a tough one. So I know when we were building the service, I had 0 people on the team, right? I had to build the team from scratch. And so initially we had actually worked with Price Waterhouse, and they had a team that could do these sort of assessments for you if you wanted, but it was pretty expensive, right? It was pretty expensive. And the problem there as well is that they don't necessarily give you the same consultants every time. So you can't build that knowledge over time, right? So you'd have to, it's almost like starting from scratch each time. So really, I would say that you need, it depends on the size of your company, but for Delta, we have about 3,500 employees. We decided that 4 would suit our needs. And I think having an in-house team, even a few of them, makes a huge difference, right? You don't want to outsource everything. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to answer that one. Maybe you can reach out to me offline, the person who asked the question, and then we can talk about it some more.
That sounds great. Thank you. Next question is from Srini at Malwarebytes. Would you expand a bit more on security gates in CI/CD pipeline? Some examples would be helpful. And he says, please ignore if the information is in fact confidential.
Yeah, so basically, if there's an SDLC process or CICD pipeline, depending on how they're developing code, you would want to make sure that they've run some sort of static code analysis or some other type of dynamic code analysis. You want to make sure that those are done and that before they can move the code, that security has signed off that the vulnerabilities have been resolved, right? So you want to make sure that that's happening. Now, how much they actually share with you it varies by company, but that is essentially what we ask for. We also ask for scan reports just to show that scans are being run. It's kind of difficult, that one, because remember, in our assessments, we can only go so far, but it's definitely better than just asking a question and just taking their word for it, right? At our company, for example, we run various types of code analysis tools, but maybe 50% of the teams use it and 50 don't. So whatever they show you, you don't know if it covers 100% of all their application teams. But like I said, it's definitely better. It shows some sort of willingness to do the right thing. I think that's really what you're looking for. There's no 100% guarantee here. I don't know if that answers your question, Srini, but.
If not, we can have an
it's partially answers my question. That's the one thing, like I also, talk about the SAST results. So make sure that the development fixes the highs and criticals before releasing the product. I'm looking for more on improving on quality gate side of it. That's exactly the project I'm working on right now.
Yeah. That's in terms of the process itself, how to improve it, that's one question, but how to test it and make sure that they're doing something is kind of what this third-party assessment is doing. I can just say that a lot of them do send us redacted reports and they show us partial information, but it's very difficult to, like, you're asking for best practices on the process itself, right?
Yes.
It's kind of a little bit beyond the scope of what third-party risk assurance does at my company, but like I said, we can talk about this offline.
Sure.
I'm not an expert in that space, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've got another question from Sean Todd, and this is, how do you do deep dive tier 1 reviews for vendors that don't get much money from your company? What incentive do they have to fully cooperate with a deep dive?
Yeah, well, if they're a tier 1, then chances are they are doing a lot of business. I don't think we have many tier 1s that we don't pay. I mean, that it's like, in theory, I suppose it could happen, but by and large, it's not the case, right? Well, I know some of the smaller companies, like, the mom and pop kind of companies who don't make a lot of money from us. It's more just the, I guess, the reputation that they have, that, hey, we have Delta Dental as one of our customers. They actually look forward to our reviews, because we don't approach it as, hey, we're an auditor here, we're here to catch you and make you look bad, but it's more about helping them, right? So if you take the approach that I'm here to help you and here to partner with you, then I think that's the way to do it. That's the incentive. It's not, I'm here to like terminate the relationship and, say bad things about you. So I think it's the approach that you use that helps in terms of getting buy-in.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I've got a question from Michelle Koblos, and this is, Kay has great tiers of classifying vendors, but it's seemingly 100% based on data classification / quantity. I'd be curious to know if they took into account criticality to the business. For example, if they're only looking at PHI and PCI, that doesn't take into account payroll vendors, for example, they may not have critical services like that, which are outsourced, but.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, that didn't tell you all the criteria. That was just a partial criteria. But we also have tier 2, which is any sort of confidential information. So I don't want to go back now, but essentially tier 1, it is PCI and over 500 records of PHI. But tier 2 was any confidential information, right? So payroll vendors would fall into that category. We also have, some of our, I'm trying to think of what other the tier 2s would be. I'm sorry, I'm just, like I said, the HVAC vendors that have access to our data centers, that's another one that's not, I guess all of it really does come down to data, right? I mean, a lot of it at the end of the day, even physical access, if they're in the building, you're concerned, not because they're in the building, because they might see PHI or PII lying around. But I would say, like, in general, whatever is not in tier 1 and has some confidentiality to it does fall into tier 2. Tier 2 also looks at if you have connections to some of our systems, so that's another thing that So I didn't put all the details in there. It was more just to give you an idea of what you could do. Every company is going to have their own system, by the way. If you're not a healthcare company, you're not even going to have PHI in there. So you have to kind of see what works for you. And it does take some tweaking over time to get it just right. I hope that helps.
That does help. And also, you had mentioned that encryption and key management typically fails. And that, I don't know, it makes my blood run cold a bit. In the cryptocurrency space, some of the largest breaches, I'm thinking, Mt. Gox, $500 million, things of this nature. When I talk to CISOs about it, there's nothing inherently wrong with the security of blockchain, but there is a real issue with poor key management. And that is what, according to the people I've spoken to, has caused some of the major losses in the cryptocurrency space. How is that acceptable? If poor key management is something that typically fails, I'd find that to be really alarming. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's one that we don't typically allow the business to just accept the risk, because they understand why it's pretty serious. I'll give you an example. There was one company, it was a very small mom and pop type shop, and they had like 10 employees, and they had some of our confidential data, not necessarily PHI, but confidential. And when we talked to them, I said, well, how often do you rotate your keys? And they said, well, when someone leaves the company, then Bill calls Mary, and we just, like, it was almost like that. It was very ad hoc. But after meeting with us and talking with our analysts, we actually got them to develop procedures, policies, develop a best practice on how to resolve that. So we did help them and got them to a better state. Another one that tends to fail is, people are using TLS 1.0, for example, weak ciphers and encryption algorithms, for example. So that's one where it's a little harder. Even our company, until recently, like, we had some of those weak ciphers, and the answer was that, well, we can't just upgrade things, because then it will affect our customers who are trying to access our sites, for example, if they're not upgraded as well. So, I mean, it's a tough one, but mostly we do try to help them, because a lot of the companies who fail, they simply don't know how to do it. It's not that they're not doing it on purpose or whatever, they simply don't know. And so education is the key there. Yeah,
no, that makes a lot of sense. We got another question just popped in from Glenn, and he would like to know, what tier would security consultants go into? What tier would a pen tester be in?
Right. So a pen tester would be a tier 2, because we don't necessarily give PHI access to a pen tester, but they have enough access where it would be concerning. So that would be a tier 2, but a regular security consultant who's, we would call them a tier 3, like Price Waterhouse coming in to help build processes would be a tier 3. But remember, we do have a questionnaire, and in there we specifically say, do you have access to confidential information, PHI? And based on that, you could be a security consultant who's a tier 1, and another consultant could be a tier 2. So again, it's not that whole category is a specific tier.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are there any other random questions out there? Anyone want to come in for a final round? Because I think we're coming up against the hour, but if you've got a final question, go quick, go fast, type quickly. But if not, Kay, thank you so much for coming. Really enjoyed it. That was a fantastic presentation and really, really helpful. And it was really great to have you back again.